Hello and welcome to the third episode of my history stuff. In the last video I spoke about Edward I and his exploitation of the military resources of Wales after he conquers Wales in 1282. I ran out of time. I didn't cover everything I wanted to, so I want to try and cover the rest in this second video. I've read quite a lot on Edward and Wales in the past couple of years. And one thing I've noticed is that while there's a lot of research and a lot of published work on this topic, it's not really been sort of put together very often. You don't get a complete picture, it's quite fragmented. And that's quite understandable because it's a very big subject and it's not easy to put it all in a neat little package. And that's not what I'm trying to do. But I do want to try and cover certain aspects and then put them together so you get some kind of sort of overall picture of what was really going on. So in the last video I spoke about Edward and his deployment of very large numbers of Welsh soldiers in Flanders and Scotland. These are the better known examples of his use of the Welsh, but in this video I wanted to cover Ireland and Gascony. I'll do Gascony first because that's a bit quicker. Gascony is in southwest France. It's called Nouvelle Aquitaine these days, and in the 13th century it's the last significant chunk of the Angevin Empire, this once mighty continental empire that Edward's ancestors ruled. By the time you get to his reign, most of it is gone. The French have taken it all, but they've still got Gascony, and Edward and his successors are absolutely determined to hang on to it. The French are equally determined to drive them out, to expel the English from the continent altogether, and throughout the 13th, 14th and up to the mid-15th century, the French repeatedly invade Gascony. They do all they can to seize it. And in 1294, war breaks out with France over the issue of Gascony. It's a war that Edward I doesn't want. He does his best to avoid it and to appease the French, but he can't do it. They're absolutely determined on this war, and in the end he's tricked. He's actually tricked into having to fight the French, which he really doesn't want to do, but he's left with no choice. And the French invade Gascony and they overrun it, and they very nearly sort of conquer the entire place in a matter of weeks, really. And Edward is forced to send continuous expeditions to try and get it back, or try and reconquer as much of it as possible. This is very difficult because Gascony is a long way from England. It takes, even in good weather, about 14 days to get ships down there from southern England. For the French, of course, all they have to do is march overland and just march straight into it. So their task is that much easier. And this is one of the reasons why Edward doesn't want to fight a war in Gascony. It's logistically very difficult, very expensive. So what he does is, in these years, the war lasts from 1294 to 98. There's a truce is agreed in 98, and then it sort of peters out. But in these 4 years, Edward is forced to spend a very large amount of money and to really draw heavily upon his resources just to get enough men and supplies down to Gascony to hold on to the remaining towns and strongholds. And sort of the English are really clinging on by their fingertips until he can come to some sort of negotiation, some arrangement with his rival, the King of France, Philip IV. And among these men are some, as you might expect, are some Welsh troops. We happen to know who these are. For instance, in February 1297, Edward sent 130 foot soldiers to serve under the Lieutenant of Gascony, the Earl of Lincoln. And of these men, 90 were Welsh, raised from the royal lordships of Kidwelly and Haverfordwest, as well as Carmarthen, which happens to be quite close to me. The men of Carmarthen were led by William Martin of Cemmaes in Pembrokeshire, and he would later serve as Justiciar of Wales, the King's officer in Wales. William is quite an interesting character. He's half Welsh himself, half English, half Welsh. And then a few months later, in early April, 5th of April, another 60 Welsh troops led by Ieuan ap Llywelyn, Henry de Rue and Ralph de Lisle are dispatched from Exeter all the way down to Gascony. So these men are actually led by a mixture of Welsh and English officers. And they're quite, obviously, they're quite small numbers of men, less than 200 in total, and not to be compared with the thousands of Welshmen Edward deploys in Flanders and Scotland. But it's still noticeable that he's using the Welsh anywhere that he needs to shore up his military position. He's sending them to all parts of this this cross-channel empire that he rules and has to defend. Edward has got effective control of England, Wales, Ireland, Gascony, Ponthieu, that's a county in the north of France on the banks of the Somme, and of course he claims lordship of Scotland, although that's very difficult to enforce. We don't know much more about what happens to these men that Edward sends to Gascony. They probably join his garrisons there and help to fight off the French. But what we do know quite a lot about is another band of Welsh soldiers who were sent to Ireland. Now Ireland is a very turbulent, troubled place. Edward's ancestors, Henry II to begin with, they imposed this sort of very unsatisfactory partial conquest of Ireland. It's not complete. The English have got effective control over perhaps 2/3 of the island, but even within the areas that they control, there's a lot of trouble. There's always these little wars, either between Irish lords or Irish lords and English lords, or it all gets very confusing and mixed up. And the English government in Dublin really struggles to impose any kind of permanent peace on Ireland. It's not really possible. And Edward, he never actually sets foot in Ireland. It's not very high on his list of priorities. England comes first, of course. And no Plantagenet king between King John, Edward's grandfather, and Richard II in the late 14th century, none of them ever visit Ireland. They don't bother to go there. They're happy to exploit it. They milk the place of food and money and supplies and soldiers to sort of support their efforts elsewhere, but they don't ever bother to go there. And Edward's attitude towards Ireland is just as sort of pragmatic or cynical, if you like, as any other king of his dynasty. He regards it as a place to be exploited, to be used when he's in need of extra soldiers, extra cash. But he has no intention of actually going there with an army to try and impose complete control of Ireland. His grandfather John tried to do that with a partial degree of success. But to try and achieve that would be enormously expensive, very difficult, and I think Edward realised that even if it could be done, it would seriously deplete his resources, and he's got priorities elsewhere. I mean, he's much more concerned with imposing direct centralised control over Wales, for instance. Ireland is not on the same level of his priorities. But that doesn't mean he completely neglects the place. I mean, it's got to be kept in a state where it's still profitable. You can't just allow it to descend into complete chaos. So what happens, again, very soon after the conquest of Wales, Edward starts drawing upon the Welsh to try and maintain a form of peace in Ireland, as he does in other places. And as it happens, we have a very complete set of records for what's going on in Ireland at this time, and the fortunes of the Welsh soldiers that Edward sends over there. So In the autumn and winter of 1285, there's a very serious rebellion in Connacht, in the northwest of Ireland. And as I said, these wars are very common. They happen a lot in Ireland. Everyone's fighting each other all the time, but some rebellions are more serious. They're more of a threat to royal authority than others, and this is one such. It's described quite vividly in the Annals of Connacht, an Irish chronicle, so I'll read it out. I hope I pronounce these Irish names correctly, by the way. If I don't, please don't take offence. So, Magnus o Conchabaia inflicted a great defeat on Adam Cossack and the Gals of West Connacht at Lech Essa Dara, where many were killed, and where Colin Cossack, Adam's brother, was taken prisoner after his men had been slaughtered in order to let him get away. So the Gals is the term for the English in Ireland, or the descendants of English colonists. This is what the Irish chroniclers call them. And the Cossacks are quite an important settler family, baronial family. And as the chronicle says, in the autumn winter of 1285, they suffer quite a serious defeat at the hands of an Irish king, King Magnus. And the government can't ignore this. They've got to intervene because this is a serious threat to their already very sort of fragile authority. So the government in Ireland, led by a chap called John the Fullborn, who is the nephew of the Justiciar, the king's officer in Ireland, he sends to Wales. And his order that survives, he says that he is seeking for Welshmen and wishes to bring them over to Ireland by the king's order for the defence of that country. So Fullborn is actually acting on Edward's direct order. Edward is clearly aware of what's happened in Ireland, that there's this very serious revolt, and he's got to take direct action. And it's interesting that Edward's response is to raise men in Wales. And from sort of the mid-1280s onwards, this is pretty much his standard response to anywhere where he needs to enforce his authority, put down rebellions. He's almost using the Welsh like a roving police force. And John the Fullborn, he manages to raise a force of 76 Welsh infantry and 4 mounted officers. Mounted officers are called vintenarii, vintners, with a constable in overall command. And along with some English troops, so this is a mixed force of English and Welsh, these men were sent over to Ireland in 2 ships from Aberconwy, that's in North Wales, in Gwynedd, and they're stationed at the castles of Roscommon and Rindown in Northern Ireland. In November, they were sent against the king's enemies in Connacht. Now this is presumably the King Magnus, who had defeated the Cossacks a few months earlier. Quite frustratingly, the record then sort of peters out a little bit. We don't actually know the result of this action being taken against the Irish in Connacht, but we do know that more Welsh troops were sent to the same area. In 1287, 2 years later, a further group of 22 Welsh soldiers under a Welsh captain named, or possibly half Irish, half Welsh, judging by his name, he's called Donogh ap David. They are sent to reinforce the garrisons of the castles of Roscommon and Rhyrid. And then another group of 51 Welsh are sent over, and they're employed as retainers to William de Valence, who succeeds as Justiciar of Ireland. William de Valence is Edward's uncle. He's very much a Frenchman. He's a Lusignan, and he's Edward's half-uncle, Earl of Pembroke, Lord of Wexford, a very powerful and important man in both Wales and Ireland. So it makes sense that troops raised in Wales would be sent to serve under his direct command in Ireland. So the most dramatic incident involving these Welsh troops actually occurs in 1289, towards the end of the decade. On 6th of November, and this is where the records get very precise, their commander, John the Fullborn, is taken prisoner in Offaly, which is about 50 kilometres from the Welsh base at Roscommon. And his capture is the result of an engagement between the O'Connors, another Irish family in the district, and the Royal Army, of which the Welsh formed at least a part. So the Welsh haven't actually done very well on this occasion. They've along with their English allies, they've engaged the Irish in battle and apparently have taken a bit of a beating. Their commander is captured, which suggests that the Irish actually won this battle. And then some very delicate negotiations follow as Edward sends one of his envoys, a man named John Bentley, to negotiate with the O'Connors to release John Fulbourn. And after some very sort of delicate talks, he is eventually freed, and the O'Connors are pardoned by the king in exchange for a very heavy fine of 1,000 marks, several £100, quite a lot of money, especially in Ireland. So this ends in a sort of quite an interesting balanced situation in which Edward's army in Ireland has actually been defeated, but in the long run the O'Connors are very careful about offending the king too much. They are happy to release his officer, and to have the king's forgiveness they will pay a very large sum of money to be forgiven. And this is probably because they don't, as I said, they don't want to draw Edward's attention to Ireland too much, because if things get too bad, if he thinks that his control is really slipping, then he will be forced to go there personally. And in 1289, this is only 7 years after the conquest of Wales, the Irish will have been perfectly aware of what Edward is capable of, that if you really get up his nose, then that's bad news. So the Welsh are enduring some quite tough service in Ireland, and this is reflected in the troop numbers. They're originally sent over from Aberconwy in 1286, but 8 years later the records show that this number has been whittled down to just 14. And these men are described as survivors of those who came from Wales to preserve the peace. So the majority of them have actually been killed in 8 years fighting in Ireland, and you've only got 14 left. And this seems to have happened sometime between 1292 and 94, because 48 of them are still alive in 1292, just 2 years earlier. So some disaster, some unrecorded disaster must have struck the Welsh garrison in Connacht in those 2 years. Or the other option is that some of them were withdrawn to serve elsewhere, because Edward is moving Welsh troops all over the place. He might have dispatched them to Gascony or even to Wales, which is in a state of revolt again at this time. And these 14 survivors, they're a bit like the Dirty Dozen, the Dirty 14. They're obviously a bunch of pretty tough veterans. They continue to serve in Ireland, and they are deployed all over the place. In the next 6 years, they're sent to Leinster, they're sent to the castle of Newcastle McKinnigan, which is in Wicklow, I think, and they're being sent to trouble spots. Leinster, for instance, had been devastated by the Irish in April 1295, and this small group of Welshmen is sent over there to help deal with that situation. The castle, Newcastle McKinnigan, was burnt as well, and over the winter of 1296-7, these 14 Welsh soldiers under their captain, a chap named John of Chester, they're actually stationed at this castle that's been burnt by the Irish. So presumably they rebuild it a little bit, and they use it as their headquarters, from which they ride out all over Leinster to, as the record says, to save the king's lands. So they're very much fulfilling an active role, even though there's only 14 of them left. They're obviously still useful. You know, you wouldn't have thought that such a tiny band of men would have been that effective, but if that was the case, they wouldn't still be in service. And there's more records of them, and by 1302, these poor men, their numbers have been cut again, and now there's only 2 of them left. Well, 3, including their captain, John of Chester. And their comrades have probably been killed in yet another outbreak, another rebellion in Leicester, which starts in 1301. And Ireland is falling into an ever greater state of chaos as a result of so many men being taken out of the country to help Edward conquer Scotland. He takes so many troops out of Ireland that just encourages more rebellions. And the troops that he's left, like this desperate band of Welsh soldiers, they're really having to struggle to cope. They're doing all this on their own, and suffering for it. They suffer very terrible casualties. So the last we see of this band of intrepid Welsh soldiers, they're still garrisoned at Newcastle Mackinnigan. Like I said, there's only 3 of them left, and then the records end. That's the last we hear of them. And you know, you would like to think that they were eventually rewarded for their long and very dangerous service and got to go home. Or the grim reality is probably that they met with a very nasty fate in Ireland, and that was that. That was the end of this force. So hopefully this has given some idea of what Edward is doing, and how he regards the Welsh and Welsh warriors, the martial potential of Wales in this period, and how he can use it to deal with problems all over his cross-channel empire. And when you put this all together, when you look at what he's doing in a space of about 20 years, the last 20 years of the reign, he's sending the Welsh to every corner of his dominions. They're in Flanders, Scotland, Ireland, Gascony, and they're very important. And without them, if Edward hadn't conquered Wales and wasn't able to draw upon this very large pool of fighting men, then he probably would have seriously struggled. His last decade is very, very difficult, and he only really gets through it by drawing very heavily on Wales, which I think casts a slightly different light on this particular king and his relationship and his doings with the Welsh. And it's one of many aspects that's worth bearing in mind and worth discussing. Okay, hopefully that was interesting. Once again, I've rambled on a bit, which I tend to do. And once again, I don't really know how to end this video, so I'm just going to press stop. If you enjoyed this and if you feel like commenting, please leave a comment below. Share the video if you like. And I'll speak to you again. Thanks.